Obviously, Brazil, major power as it relates to South America, with issues surrounding many things happening in Brazil. But Brazil is also going to be the host of COP30, a big UN conference that's going to be happening there. And so will you see U.S. officials going there? You've seen the U.S. pulling out of substantial agreements when it relates to climate. You've also seen the U.S. pulling out of significant conferences around the world as it relates to sort of coming together as a whole to solve these issues, whether it be climate, whether it be trying to solve, and end wars. I mean, the president said today he's ended 7 wars, but received no UN support in finalizing peace deals. He touted lower inflation and higher wages and claimed that the U.S. is the hottest country in the world. Not a reference to what the UN is focused on, which is climate change, but talking about deals and trade and all of that. So very interesting words coming out of the president from the UN.
Myles, do we have any sense of how the U.S. and the United Nations actually interact and function together, if at all, under this administration? Because just taking the rhetoric here, it seems like President Trump really does not want anything to do with the United Nations and some of its mandates and goals.
Right. We have to see what the engagement will be of Mike Waltz now, as the UN ambassador. How will he engage with his partners on the world stage? Marco Rubio speaking, today, had his emissaries out in New York, of course, speaking about meetings that he's having. What my thought is going to be is that they'll have a cautious approach, right? The president has continued to distance the U.S. from multilateral institutions, whether it be UNESCO, whether it be the Human Rights Council, whether it be the WHO. And he's really rejected core UN priorities like climate change and asylum protection. So how do you square the need to work together to come to peace talks in the Middle East, perhaps, with, the idea that the UN, or the president's idea that the UN is just not doing enough? And how do you do that when the US's arrears remain unpaid and that funding has largely stopped since the president's taken office? He's going to have to, sort of rebuild the relationships, and you haven't had a UN ambassador, a permanent one in that role since the start of the administration, really. So how do you sort of square that? It's going to be quite a task for Marco Rubio. It's going to be quite a task for Mike Waltz. And then all of these conversations that happen on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly be very important, because, maybe they just make these deals without any UN involvement. And that's really what's been happening in the past couple of months.
So I'm glad you mentioned the sidelines, because, of course, that's where a lot of the business does get done at this kind of gathering. What do we know, Myles, about who the president is likely to meet during his time here at the UN General Assembly, and what kinds of conversations he might likely have?
Right. We know that the president's meeting with Arab leaders while he is in New York. We know that the president is expected to meet with folks, on the sidelines, in the General Assembly Hall as well. The meeting with Arab leaders is going to be very crucial, right? When you see, a strike, happening in Qatar, how do you, and Israel saying that they had no responsibility, how do you square that with the deals that are being made in the Middle East, right? So the president's going to have to sort of walk that tight line with having a great relationship with some of these Middle East partners, but then, the big U.S. partner being Israel. How do you walk that fine line? One thing that happened yesterday was that we learned from the State Department that the Iranian diplomats that are here in New York will be confined to basically the UN. And that's it. So they'll go to the UN meetings. They'll have their sideline meetings at the hotels. They can't shop here, right? So there are sort of very specific restrictions that are being put on countries that are being announced by the State Department. All of that is in an effort to show, or from the White House and from the State Department, to show the U.S. is in charge when you come to the UN General Assembly. They're going to be controlling the message, and it'll be interesting to see what the readouts are from any of those meetings that the president's having.